Welcome to the deep dive. Are millennials really up against tougher economic odds than earlier generations? I mean, it's a question a lot of people are asking these days.
It really is.
And that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today with Alexander Baima's book, Young, Broken, Educated,
Right.
which blends history, personal stories, and hard data, to try to get to the bottom of this question.
Yeah.
Um,
What really struck me about the book is how Baima goes beyond just, comparing like incomes from one generation to the next.
yeah.
He digs into those underlying systems, like how those systems have shifted
Hmm.
and how those shifts might actually be putting millennials at a disadvantage.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
One of the core arguments in the book is this idea of declining purchasing power.
Hmm.
And it's not just that, a dollar doesn't go as far as it used to.
Right.
It's that some really critical costs and things you really need have just absolutely skyrocketed compared to what older generations had to deal with.
Yeah. And he uses some really vivid examples.
Okay. One that really stuck with me was the Golden Gate Bridge toll
Oh.
back in 1989.
Hmm.
If you were driving a 2-axle trailer across the bridge, that would set you back $3.
$3.
By 2019, that same trip costs you almost 10 times as much.
What?
We're talking $29.40.
Oh my gosh.
So it's just this massive jump.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if if wages have kept pace with that kind of increase.
Right. I mean, you think about it, that's a huge difference.
It is.
Whether you're commuting every day or you're just trying to, get away for the weekend.
Exactly. And Baima argues that wages haven't kept pace, especially for those younger workers. And he also points to things like public transit fares have gone up a lot.
Yeah.
And of course, the big one, college tuition.
Oh, yeah.
All of which have really outpaced inflation.
Yeah. Speaking of college tuition, that feels like a huge burden.
Yeah.
I mean, for a lot of millennials. Is that something that Baima digs into? He does, and it kind of leads into this whole discussion of debt.
Okay.
Because millennials are carrying more debt than any generation before them.
Yeah, that's no surprise.
And he links this in part to, historical changes in how we approach things like mortgages.
Okay, so how does the history of mortgages tie into this?
Well, Baima takes us back to the 1930s when FDR established Federal Housing Administration, or FHA.
Yeah.
And the goal was to make homeownership more accessible, to more people.
Yeah, which on the surface sounds like a good thing, right?
It
I
does.
mean, who doesn't want to own a home?
Right, but it actually led to some unintended consequences.
Okay, what do you mean?
It led to those longer mortgage terms that we often see today,
Oh, okay.
like those 30-year mortgages,
Yeah.
which Baima argues contributed to riskier lending practices.
Okay.
And, the situation where people might end up paying way more in interest
Right.
over the lifetime of that loan.
Yeah, because even if your monthly payment is lower, if you stretch it out over 30 years, you're paying interest for way longer.
Exactly. It's just one piece of the puzzle, though.
Right.
We also have to consider those student loans, which are huge for a lot of millennials.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And auto debt, which has just ballooned for this generation.
Yeah, so even if they are earning more than previous generations were at the same age, a bigger chunk of that income is just going right back out the door.
Yeah, towards paying off all that debt.
Okay, so we've got this declining purchasing power. We've got this mountain of debt. It's starting to sound pretty bleak.
Right.
But Baima doesn't stop there.
He doesn't.
He goes on to argue that there are these bigger systemic issues at play as well.
Exactly. And this is where it starts to get really interesting.
Okay.
Because he starts looking at the role of institutions and policies.
Yeah.
And how those might be impacting millennials differently than previous generations.
Okay.
One example he gives is the rise of staffing agencies, which can create this less stable work environment for younger employees.
So instead of being directly hired by a company, you're working through an agency.
Right.
Which could mean less job security or, fewer benefits.
Exactly. That's the idea. And he also talks about the rise of at-will employment, which basically means you can be let go from a job for any reason.
Oh, wow.
Without much warning.
Yeah.
It creates this sense of uncertainty.
Yeah. It definitely feels like the job market has changed a lot.
Yes.
Even just in the last, decade or two. But what about the bigger picture here?
All right.
What kind of solutions does Baima propose?
Well, this is where he dives into some potentially controversial ideas.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
He criticizes what he calls trickle-down economics.
Oh, yeah.
That theory that if you cut taxes for the wealthy.
Yeah, I've heard that term before.
Right.
But to be honest, I'm not entirely sure I understand what it actually means.
Well, basically, it's the idea that if wealthy individuals and corporations have more money,
Okay.
they'll invest more, they'll create jobs.
Mhm.
And that prosperity will eventually trickle down to everybody else.
Okay.
But Baima argues that it hasn't really worked out that way in practice.
So what does he propose instead?
He calls his alternative steam-up economics.
Okay. Interesting, Dean.
And it focuses on removing obstacles to upward mobility.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of waiting for the wealth to trickle down,
Yeah.
he wants to empower people to kind of rise up from the bottom.
Okay, so things like investing in education,
Mm-hmm.
job training,
Mm-hmm.
making sure people have access to those opportunities.
Exactly. He also looks at the impact of things like immigration and outsourcing,
Mm-hmm.
Arguing that these factors can contribute to wage stagnation
Okay.
and job insecurity, particularly for those middle-class workers.
Yeah, that's something that we hear a lot about in the news and in political debates.
Right.
But it's such a complex issue
It is.
because immigration also brings a lot of benefits,
Mm-hmm.
to the economy.
Absolutely. And Baima acknowledges that he's not saying that these things are inherently bad,
Right.
but he is raising these questions about how they're impacting the economic landscape for millennials.
Yeah, so we've got this declining purchasing power.
Mm-hmm.
We've got this burden of debt
Right.
and these systemic issues like the rise of staffing agencies,
Mm-hmm.
this at-will employment. Are there any other, major challenges that Baima highlights?
Yeah, he spends a good chunk of the book talking about taxes
Okay.
and government programs.
Mm-hmm.
And he argues that some of the current policies might actually be discouraging upward mobility.
That's interesting. I could see how that would work.
Mhm.
If you're worried about your taxes going up
Right.
or losing certain benefits,
Exactly.
it might make you hesitant to earn more
Mm-hmm.
or to seek out promotions or better paying jobs.
It's a disincentive. And he also talks about something called the welfare cliff,
Okay.
where people might actually be reluctant to take a raise
Really?
because it could mean losing access to government assistance. That's worth more than the increase in pay.
Wow. So it's like you want to improve your financial situation,
Mm-hmm.
but the system is kind of punishing you for it.
That's one of the arguments he's making. And he also raises concerns about those long-term programs,
Okay.
like Social Security
Mm-hmm.
and government pensions.
Yeah.
Especially with an aging population and people living longer.
Yeah, I can see how that puts a real strain on the system.
It does.
But at the same time, those programs are essential,
Yeah.
for so many people,
Mhm.
especially retirees.
Right.
It feels like a really tough problem to solve.
It is a tough problem, and Baima doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but
Mhm.
he does raise some really thought-provoking questions.
Okay.
And he explores some alternative solutions that we'll get to later in this deep dive.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
This is fascinating stuff already.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Okay, so let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll delve into some of those more controversial ideas.
Sounds good. One thing that really resonated with me was how he connects these challenges to the growing influence of the wealthy and powerful. Like, he argues that they play a huge role in shaping the economic landscape,
Cool.
but often to the detriment of, everyday people,
Right.
and especially millennials.
Okay, that's a pretty bold claim.
It is.
Does he give any, specific examples of how that's happening?
Yeah, he uses Detroit as a case study
Okay.
to kind of illustrate how that concentrated power
Mm-hmm.
and poor decision-making by those in charge
Yep.
can have these, devastating consequences.
Okay.
He points to the city's over-reliance on a single industry
Mm-hmm.
and those excessively high taxes
Okay.
as contributing factors to his economic decline.
So he's arguing that Detroit's problems weren't just about, market forces or
Mm.
globalization,
Mm-hmm.
but also about, choices made by those in power.
Exactly. And then he connects this to the broader issue of wealth inequality.
Okay.
And he cites some pretty startling statistics.
Like what? Did you know that according to Reuters,
Mm-hmm.
the bottom 40% of Americans actually have a negative net worth?
Wow, that's hard to even wrap my head around.
It is.
How is that even possible?
Well, he dives into how factors like, debt,
Mm-hmm.
lack of assets,
Mm.
and stagnant wages can contribute to that situation.
Yeah.
But he also points out that when it comes to land ownership,
Mm-hmm.
the disparity is even more extreme.
Right.
The top 5 landowning families in the U.S.
Okay.
control 9 million acres.
9 million acres.
That's larger than the entire state of Maryland.
That's insane. I had no idea
Yeah.
that the concentration of land ownership was that extreme.
It's pretty wild.
So I guess when we talk about the 1%. We're not just talking about income,
Right.
but also control over resources and assets.
Exactly. And this kind of ties back to his earlier point about the aging population.
Okay.
He argues that the growing number of retirees puts this huge strain on government resources.
And creates this political incentive to prioritize the needs of older voters.
Right.
Who are more likely to vote over
Yes.
those of younger generations.
It's like a generational tug of war
It is.
for resources and political power. I'm curious, though, does he place the blame solely on the wealthy and powerful?
Not entirely.
Okay.
He definitely emphasizes personal responsibility as well.
Okay.
He criticizes what he sees as this culture of instant gratification. And, encourages millennials to develop more of a long-term mindset when it comes to finances.
Right.
Stressing the importance of things like saving, investing, building financial literacy.
So it's not just about changing the system.
Right.
It's also about equipping individuals with the tools and the knowledge that they need to succeed.
But he also points out that, individual choices are made within the context of that larger system.
Right.
So if the system is rigged against you, it's going to be that much harder to get ahead no matter how hard you work.
Yeah. It's like trying to run a race where some people start like miles ahead of the starting line.
Exactly. And it makes it seem unfair.
Right. But if I'm understanding correctly, he's not advocating for like a complete overhaul of capitalism.
Not necessarily. He acknowledges that capitalism has its strengths. But he argues that it needs to be reformed and rebalanced to create a more equitable playing field.
Right.
He's especially critical of what he sees as the financialization of the economy.
Okay, what does that mean?
It's where the focus has shifted from producing actual goods and services to kind of manipulating money and extracting wealth through these complex financial instruments.
So instead of focusing on like creating real value, the system has become more about like making money from money.
Exactly.
Okay, I can see how that could be problematic.
And he uses hedge funds as an example, pointing out that the top 10 hedge funds in the world control this massive amount of wealth. And it really raises questions about, who benefits from the system and whether it's truly serving the needs of the majority.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, declining purchasing power, the burden of debt, the influence of the wealthy and powerful. But what about solutions?
Right.
Does Baima offer any like concrete ways to address these issues?
He does, and this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Because he doesn't shy away from discussing some potentially controversial ideas.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Like socialism,
okay,
debt forgiveness, and even cryptocurrency as possible ways to create a more equitable and sustainable economic future.
Okay, let's start with socialism.
Okay.
That's a word that gets thrown around a lot.
It does.
In political debates. But I'm not sure everyone really understands what it actually means.
Yeah. Right. And Baima acknowledges that it has a bit of a negative connotation, especially in the United States.
Yeah.
But, he discusses the potential drawbacks, like government overreach, stifled innovation.
Okay.
But he also points to examples like the Nordic model, those Scandinavian countries that have successfully combined elements of socialism with a market-based economy to achieve high levels of social well-being.
So he's not necessarily advocating for like a full-blown socialist revolution.
No.
But rather suggesting that we can learn from countries that have implemented socialist policies in a more pragmatic way.
Exactly. And he suggests exploring ideas like, expanding access to affordable health care and education, similar to what we see in some of those Nordic countries.
Okay, what about debt forgiveness?
Yeah, that's another hot button issue.
It is.
But Baima dives into the potential benefits and drawbacks there as well. He points to historical examples like the Jubilee year in ancient Israel, where debts were periodically forgiven to prevent widespread poverty and social unrest.
So it's interesting to consider debt forgiveness, not just as an economic policy, but also as like a social and moral issue.
Exactly. And he raises that question, is it fair to burden an entire generation with this crippling debt?
Right.
Especially when that debt is often tied to things like education, which is supposed to be this pathway to a better life.
Okay, what about cryptocurrency?
Yeah, that seems like a pretty radical solution.
It does.
But he sees it as a potential tool for challenging that existing financial system,
Hmm.
which he argues is, overly centralized
Yeah.
and controlled by a select few.
Mm-hmm.
He highlights the potential benefits of blockchain technology,
Yep.
the system behind cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin.
So it's not just about like investing in Bitcoin and hoping it goes up in value.
Right.
It's about exploring the potential of this technology
Mm-hmm.
to create a more like decentralized and transparent financial system.
That's the idea. And he argues that, blockchain could empower individuals
Okay.
by giving them more control over their finances and
Mhm.
reducing their reliance on traditional banks and institutions.
It sounds very futuristic,
It does.
but I can see how, in theory,
Yeah.
it could level the playing field
Mm-hmm.
and create new opportunities,
Mm.
but it also feels risky.
He acknowledges those risks,
Mm-hmm.
Cryptocurrency is still a relatively new and volatile asset class,
Right.
and there are concerns about regulation
Yeah.
and the potential for scams.
Okay, so out of all these potential solutions,
Huh.
socialism, debt, forgiveness, cryptocurrency,
Mm-hmm.
is there one that he seems to, like, favor?
He doesn't explicitly endorse any one solution as a magic bullet.
Okay.
He presents them as options to consider and encourages readers to think critically about which approaches might be most effective in addressing the economic challenges facing their generation.
So it sounds like he's really trying to empower millennials
He is.
to take ownership of their economic future,
Mm-hmm.
both by, like, advocating for systemic change,
Right.
but also providing the tools and the knowledge for individual empowerment.
Absolutely. He wants them to understand the forces that are shaping the world around them
Mm-hmm.
and to actively participate in creating a more just and sustainable future.
It feels like a lot of these challenges maybe stem from people not really understanding, how our financial system works.
He dives into that for sure.
Does Baima offer any insights into how all that works?
Yeah, he spends a good chunk of the book going way back,
Oh, no.
exploring the history of money, from bartering
Mm-hmm.
to the development of what we use today, those fiat currencies like the dollar.
For those of us who aren't economists,
Mm.
can you break down what fiat currency even means
Yeah.
and why it matters?
Basically, fiat currency means the value of the money isn't backed by anything tangible, like gold. It's based on the government just declaring that it's legal tender.
So it's all based on, like, trust in the system.
Exactly. And Baima argues that this system is inherently fragile,
Okay.
because when governments can just print money at will,
Right.
that can lead to inflation
Hmm.
and erode the purchasing power of people's savings.
Yeah, that makes sense if there's more money circulating.
Right.
But the same amount of goods and services,
Mm-hmm.
prices are going to go up.
Exactly. It's like the value of each dollar decreases.
Right.
He contrasts this with assets like gold and silver,
Mm.
which he sees as having intrinsic value.
Okay.
I mean, they've been used as forms of money for centuries
Right.
and have historically held their value even when fiat currencies have failed.
So is he suggesting that millennials should, like, diversify and look beyond traditional stocks and bonds?
Yeah, he sees those as a hedge against inflation
Okay.
and economic uncertainty. And he points out that, gold and silver have those industrial uses as well.
Right.
So their value isn't solely tied to their role as money.
It's like a safety net in case the current financial system goes haywire.
Right.
That's an interesting perspective. It's like having a backup plan for your money,
Hmm.
but wouldn't investing in gold or silver be pretty complicated?
It can seem intimidating,
Yeah.
but Baima gives some guidance on how to get started.
Okay.
And there are more accessible ways to do it these days, like
Mhm.
through exchange-traded funds
Right.
or even certain types of retirement accounts.
So he's encouraging millennials to be more proactive and informed
Yeah.
when it comes to managing their money.
He really emphasizes that financial literacy.
Mm-hmm.
He wants people to understand how the system works
Yeah.
so they can make smart choices
Right.
and protect themselves.
It's something we could all benefit from.
Yeah,
I mean, regardless of our generation.
for sure.
It's so easy to get caught up, in that consumerism and lose sight of those long-term goals.
And he encourages millennials to think about investing as that long-term strategy,
Right.
not about getting rich quick.
Mm-hmm.
He cautions against getting caught up in those speculative bubbles,
Oh, yeah?
using the example of the 1929 stock market crash
Ooh.
as this reminder that markets can be volatile.
Right. It's easy to get swept up in the hype when everyone seems to be making money,
Mm-hmm.
but it can disappear just as quickly.
That's right.
So while the book kind of paints this somewhat bleak picture of the economic challenges that millennials are facing.
Right.
It also offers, I think, a sense of hope
Yeah.
and empowerment.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he's saying, yes, the system is rigged,
Right.
but you're not powerless.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are tools and strategies that you can use to navigate this landscape and build a better future.
And he uses this really compelling analogy.
Oh, I love a good analogy.
Yeah, he talks about the myth of Icarus,
Okay.
who flew too close to the sun and melted his wax wings.
Right.
It's often used as this cautionary tale about hubris and overreaching.
But there's a twist, right?
There is.
Because Icarus's father also warned him not to fly too low,
Right.
because the sea spray would weigh him down.
Exactly.
Right.
He'd drown.
So it's not just about avoiding reckless ambition,
Mhm.
but also about not letting that fear or complacency hold you back.
So it's about finding that sweet spot
Yeah.
between being cautious, but also taking calculated risks,
Mm-hmm.
pushing boundaries,
Right.
striving for something more.
Even when the odds seem stacked against you.
I love that analogy.
It's a good one.
It's like he's saying, yes, the world is full of challenges,
Mm-hmm.
but don't let that stop you from soaring. Just
Yeah.
make sure you've got a good pair of wings
Right.
and a clear sense of direction.
I think that's a powerful message
It is.
for millennials, you
Right.
know, who are trying to navigate this economic landscape.
So what's the ultimate takeaway for listeners who are ready to take action?
Baima encourages people to start by educating themselves.
Okay.
Read books like his.
Mm-hmm.
Engage in these conversations.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to challenge the status quo.
And maybe start thinking about those alternative investment strategies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, explore those options like precious metals or cryptocurrency. But most importantly, take control
Yes.
of your financial future.
Don't wait for the system to change.
Right.
Start building a more resilient and secure financial life for yourself.
Today.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into Young, Broke, and Educated.
It has.
It's a really thought-provoking book.
Mm-hmm.
It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about the economy
For sure.
and empowers us to take control of our financial destiny.
Yeah, great conversation.
Thanks for joining us.